to introduce to you. Rob is a pastor over in Newbury Park, and we do attend his church. And there's someone that is not afraid to speak his mind and talk about values and things that we think are important. He and his wife Michelle have 5 children. He's a graduate of Fresno State, was captain of the swim team. His family was a Navy family, grew up in Coronado, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Right. And so over the years of hearing him speak, we've become more and more impressed. And then when he decided to enter this race, on the one hand, we were concerned about the time and effort that it would take and away from his ministry, but on the other hand, it's exactly what we feel is needed in this time when we need to have people with conviction in ethics and morality and talk about these issues in terms of our politics. And the thing I'd like to mention to have, we get the term diversity thrown at us a lot. Democrats and liberals always talk about diversity, and I think that's something we ought to have in Sacramento, because we sure don't have it now. So anyway, Lene would like to say a few words, and then we'll turn it over.
Well, I just would like to say that we know Rob to be a good man and a kind man and a man of the deepest integrity. And have you ever heard this saying, Lord, make me the man that my dog thinks I am? Yeah. Rob is that man. So I just want to ask Rob one question. Rob, do you believe in climate change?
Linnea teed me up. If any of you were at the debate, they asked me that question, do I believe in climate change? And my response was, yes, I do. I believe Sacramento needs a climate change. So, well, the only thing you left out, Rick, was when you said I was a graduate of Fresno State, you left out the part that Fresno State is the Harvard of the San Joaquin Valley. I was born and raised in Coronado, California. My father was a naval officer. He had 3 tours of Vietnam. My mother was president of the Republican Women. My dad was president of the Rotary. I grew up walking precincts as a boy. I remember walking precincts in 1978 for Proposition 13, the People's Initiative, that has saved our taxpayers over $700 billion since 1978. And that was my life. I remember my mother, 3.5 years ago, she passed away of lung cancer. And my dad is in a rest home with Alzheimer's right now. But 3.5 years ago, when my mother was in ICU, only a few folks could go in at a time if you've ever been to an ICU and you know how that works. So I was in the waiting room, just avoiding the inevitable, and our family kind of deals with pain and heaviness with humor. So I was playing on my phone, and I came across an app on my phone, and if I tell you this, you're probably not going to vote for me, but hear me out. And the app was really interesting. It said it was a conception calendar. So if you type in your birth date, it tells you when you were conceived. I thought, that's kind of fun. So I type in August 10th, 1964. And in case some of you are trying to figure out how old I am, I'm 50. And so I typed in August 10th, 1964, and the date for my conception came up the day that Kennedy was shot. You're pretty sharp here. You're a numbers guy. He'd already figured it out. You scare me.
I tell you, I will always remember.
Well, hear this story. So I figured I was conceived the day Kennedy was shot. It was my turn to go into ICU. Now my mother's got a mask on because she needs oxygen. It's covering the entirety of her face. And I was avoiding the inevitable. And so we just had a joke. I said, Mom, I was playing on my phone and I found out I was conceived when Kennedy was shot. She said through the mask, "We were the last in the country to know." So 1964, something interesting happened. I was born, but that was the interesting aspect. In October of '64, there was a lifelong Democrat who was also the president of a union who endorsed a presidential candidate by the name of Ronald Reagan, who endorsed Barry Goldwater, and his name was Ronald Reagan. And he had been a lifelong Democrat. And the message that he gave at the Republican Party convention was so stirring. He talked about individual responsibility and individual rights and this conservative principles that he'd been taught by Bulward, who was the CEO of General Electric. But the whole country was captivated by this actor that seemed educated. And they asked him to run for office for California governor in 1966. He was 55 years old. He'd never run for office before, and he threw his hat in the ring to run for governor. They said he couldn't beat Edmund Brown, Pat Brown. And of course he did win, we all know that, and he served 2 terms as governor. And I had the privilege of meeting him in 1975 after he'd been governor. He was promoting a book called The Quotable Ronald Reagan. And my mother made us drive quite a distance to meet him, and I was the one she took inside to meet Ronald Reagan, and I'll never forget, he rubbed my head, and he said, "How you doing?" He rubbed my head, and he took the piece of paper I had, and he signed it. He said, "Best wishes, Robert McCoy, Ronald Reagan." I still have that to this day. Best wishes, Robert McCoy, Ronald Reagan. But what he didn't realize back then was that he was endorsing my campaign today. So. But I was so moved by that man's life. I watched as my father left the Navy after 3 tours of Vietnam and served his country faithfully and started a business. And as you recall, from 76 to 80, we had a president by the name of Jimmy Carter. And during Jimmy Carter's time, we had some just awful things happen in our country. The Russians invaded Afghanistan. Iran, our embassy was taken over, and our embassy personnel were held hostage. And as the country was going through struggles, we had double-digit interest rates, double-digit inflation. The president would come on and blame the American people and say, you know, you need to deal with it, put on a sweater, turn down the thermostat. We had odd and even gas lines. You remember those? I remember as a boy all of this. I remember the highlight for us was when our Winter Olympic hockey team beat the Russians. And we were so excited about that. I was like rooting for Seabiscuit in the Great Depression. But as Americans, we were trying to hold on to anything that had hope. And my father had a small business at the time called Special Products. And he went through the malaise and the misery of the Carter years and watching what was happening in California. And what was interesting is, as we were wondering if we were going to be able to keep our home and the struggles we were going through as a family, I remember the heaviness of it, especially driving over the Coronado Bay Bridge and looking at our Pacific Fleet ever shrinking and watching as our footprint and our strength around the world was diminishing. And every night watching the hostages being paraded in front of the television sets to the humiliation of the American people. And then I remember we attempted a rescue mission and all of our helicopters were strewn across the desert. And I remember when we had the funeral for 2 of those personnel, it was in my own hometown because they were special forces and Coronado was the hub of special forces. The sadness was palpable. And then I remember this man was elected to president. And when Ronald Reagan came into office, I remember the hostages were released immediately. The lights went on in the gas stations. Industry started to churn, and it was wonderful to be an American again. I remember that. I was moved by that. I remember I couldn't vote for him in 80, or in 82, but I voted for him in 84. He didn't run in 82, but I graduated from high school in 82, and I voted for him in 84. I did walk precincts for him. And that was my life. And I wasn't, our family would be considered physical conservatives. We weren't churchgoers. I don't remember ever stepping foot in a church with my folks. They were moral people, don't get me wrong, but we just weren't churchgoers. I became a man of faith in college. When I left Coronado, I went to Fresno State on the swimming and water polo scholarship. I know it's hard to believe I was a swimmer or a water polo player. I look more like a buoy now, but I was. And I became a man of faith when I was at Fresno State. And when I graduated from Fresno State, I went into sales. I started to work for Helene Curtis. They make Suave shampoo and Finesse shampoo. I was a salesman for them. And then they were purchased by a company called Cheeseboro Ponds. They make Pond's cold cream and Q-tips and Vaseline intensive care lotion. And I became an area manager with them. And then they were purchased by the largest consumer products company in the world called Unilever. They make Snuggle fabric softener. I became a divisional manager with them. I called on the headquarters of Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas. Worked with a number of large chains in California. And then my wife and I married. Michelle and I married in 1990. We've been married 25 years come April. We have 5 kids. My 3 oldest are my girls, Molly, Kelly, and Natasha, 23, 22, 21. And my boys are Daniel and Michael, 15 and 12. Now, 4 of them are homegrown. My wife gave birth to 4 of them. And our middle daughter, Natasha, we adopted from Russia when she was 12. She's 21 now. And my oldest, Molly, she got married a year ago, August. And her and her husband, Micah, made Michelle and I grandparents 6 weeks ago. So I'm officially grandpa.
Woo!
My son-in-law is, I call him son-in-law. My son-in-law is black and my daughter is so white she's translucent. So my grandson is blonde and lightly toasted. Good-looking fella. And when Michelle and I married, I was working for Unilever at the time, and I switched over to a company called AC Nielsen Ratings. And I just hated it. And Michelle had witnessed in my life when I had worked just voluntarily in ministry when I was at Fresno State when we were engaged, or at least when I was in Fresno, stationed there when we were engaged. And she just knew there was a calling on my life. So we left the sales industry and I went to seminary in Fresno. And when we got to Fresno in the early 90s, a lot of you may remember the LA riots. Hard to forget. Well, Fresno was at about 211 degrees at the same time, and you know at 212 degrees water begins to boil. The city was about to explode. And I was a starving seminary student, $395 a unit. My wife and I didn't want to incur any debt, so we lived in what would be the equivalent of Section 8 housing on First and Shields. It was a demarcation zone where Fresno just started to get awful. And Fresno had in the early 90s, Fresno had the second highest murder rate of any city in the United States. Had the second highest car theft rate of any city in the U.S. We had a car stolen from our driveway and 2 cars were broken into of friends that were visiting. And if you called 911, it would take over an hour for an officer to arrive.